Brothers and sisters, assalamu alaikum. Good evening and welcome to another night of a City Circle. Our topic again tonight focuses around Palestine, but I think it has a very interesting twist this evening. We've had many talks here and indeed around London in general about this topic, and there's been many marches, and there's been many Facebook likes, and there's been many retweets, and there's been a lot of social media discussion around these causes. And in recent years, I think we've all experienced a greater and deeper sense of this single issue as a global issue becoming more at the forefront of people's minds. And when I say people, I mean not just the Muslim community. I think it's become an international issue. And so there's clearly a great deal of sense of momentum. But this evening, it's a bit of an introspective and maybe even a critical discussion about what perhaps we as a community could be doing more. Taking that momentum and applying real-world examples about how we can do things on a day-to-day level. And in looking at that, we've got two different speakers with some very unique perspectives to focus in on that. I'd like to think of them as the home and away team. We've got Cal, who's going to talk more about what we can do away, whereas in Palestine, and Zania talking about what we can do in the UK and home. So if I introduce our first two speakers, we first have Zania Khan, who's to my left, who has a BA Honours from Fashion Design Technology and Surface Textile from the London College of Fashion. She's the first Muslim ethical designer in the UK and is founder of Zania K. She's got a wide range of experience over the last 10 years, working as a designer for high street brands, working with the youth and BAME communities, delivering creating therapy projects and upcycling eco workshops. She was the World Hijab Day UK ambassador. Is that? You still are, right? Congratulations. And has a dress displayed at the Museum of London, which inspired her to leave mainstream fashion and focus on her ethical brands that puts humans before profit. Zina works as a project manager at Made in Europe, which many of you I'm sure know, and has a good relationship with the City Circle, and manages the Made shop, promoting products ethically sourced from Palestine. Please welcome Zina. Going from home to away is Khalil Desai. Khalil's professional background is he's a human rights lawyer and a legal advisor to the government's legal services. This means for about the last 8 years or so he's been working in Whitehall, advising on various government departments. He in particular worked as one of the senior lawyers on the Leviton inquiry, and on his day-to-day job he focuses on judicial review proceedings based on the ECHR for the government. But most recently, and the reason why Cal's here, is that he was working in Palestine on sabbatical, specifically in East Jerusalem. He's been acting as an advisor to several local Palestinian NGOs and civil society organisations, working to broaden their scope and to advise on how they achieve maximum impact for their work. Both of them are going to explain a bit about what they do, but they've both said specifically they want to focus on a lot of Q&A. So again, please welcome Khalil Desai. Housekeeping is all of 30 seconds. In the event of a fire, you'll find that there is an exit there, or else fails, run. And so without further ado, I understand, Cal, you're ready to go first, if that's okay. Do you need anything in terms of props or visual aids?
No.
Fine. Okay. All right, so I'll leave the floor to you.
Okay, thanks, Bilal, and thank you all for coming. I've set myself two aims for today. Firstly, I want to try and bring the Palestinians I met and spoke to over the last year when I was in Palestine to the forefront of this discussion. I want to try and give you a more tangible sense of what ordinary, which is firmly in inverted commas, what ordinary life is like for them. And I think fundamental to this is to focus on the day-to-day. I'm going to argue as part of my presentation that it's these routine, but also these unnoticed features of their lives which betray what is the most insidious and damaging aspects of the occupation. I think on the lives of these ordinary Palestinians, I think it's these, particularly at the moment, I think it's these ordinary lives which explain the recent actions of young men and women who are generally children acting out of desperation more than anything else with all the violence that's currently occurring in East Jerusalem and elsewhere in Palestine. But even though it's these human experiences that have certainly informed my professional life as a lawyer, focused on delineating individual rights, this experience that has had, it's because of that my experience has, over the last 6 months, resonated so much. But the importance of the granular detail is not just because it's something that I'm used to as part of my legal life. I think it focuses on and it helps me explain the other key aim of this presentation. And that's to say that the fundamental kind of point I want to make is that this detail, the nuance, is the first victim of the need for a digestible media narrative. So it seems to me that we're forced into framing our activism primarily along the binary lines of two sides in a conflict over land. After my time in Palestine, I now say to do so exclusively is to fall into a trap. I think the implications being that in doing so, we're subscribing, or even worse, we're being trapped by a narrative which has and continues to dehumanize Palestinians. So what do I mean by this? So whilst macro issues like statehood, recognition, settlements, the BBC, whatever it might be, head up the list of demands, it feels like there's little space for the worsening experience of the Palestinians now, today, and what's happening on the ground, as we speak, in fact. So I think what I found is that that sort of narrative, that sort of discussion, all but leaves kind of a lumpen mass of people who feel abandoned by their own political leaders, certainly, and are stereotyped by the international community. This is exactly what I believe is at the root of why so many young people, young Palestinians in East Jerusalem over the last few weeks believe occupation is a fate worse than death. So my intention is to develop both these 2 points as part of this, as part of my presentation. But what's really important is that after that, as part of our discussion, we bring out some of those issues and where I hope to share some of the more specific examples. But let me just lay down kind of the general kind of feeling that I had in relation to those two kind of aims. So why I want the narrative to change, and even including, as Bilal has rightly said, within our own circles, is for the following reasons. Like so many of you, for as long as I can remember, I've been exercised by the Palestinian struggle, and specifically the struggle for a Palestinian homeland, a state. I often find myself, as I'm sure you guys have, in circular arguments about what needs to come first, or sat where you are clinging to any sort of vestiges of hope for a Palestinian homeland. I know, from some of the people in the audience here that we've marched on the same marches, we've demonstrated each time the Israelis' bombs fall, but I'm questioning exactly what that has achieved, because it feels like it hasn't achieved much for the Palestinian people. That's not to say it's not important, but it's how we incorporate other elements of our activism in addition to that. So what changed over the course of this year, whilst I was working in Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem, and working extensively across all of the Palestinian neighbourhoods, with the exception of the Gaza Strip, advising several Palestinian civil society institutions, is the realisation that I myself become trapped by a narrative which is extremely reductive. And possibly worse, it now feels to me like it leaves no space for the Palestinians themselves. This is why this talk has been provocatively suggested that it dehumanises the Palestinian people. My experience of shadowing the lives of Palestinians leads me to the core of the argument. It goes along these lines. Certainly foremost and firstly, is that nearly all the Palestinians I met and spoke to wanted to be awarded the same license and space as all of us, to be treated as individuals. That means with hopes, fears, ideas, vulnerabilities, born out of their long history and culture. Some of those are inexorably linked to their lives under occupation or as refugees. But equally, much of what they believe or want is uniquely individual and shaped by their own personality and experiences, just like us. It's important this is not overlooked, I say, because they're clear to be afforded an identity, and I would say their humanity, not just by the Israelis, but the rest of us too, resonated extremely clearly with me. So to move that on, why is that important and relevant? I've explained that many of the Palestinian people I met, were at pains to emphasize that there was much more to the Palestinian identity than just the struggle. Again, in inverted commas. And during my time there, I understood why. It served only to create this amorphous entity engaged only in conflict. It was not that the Palestinians I spoke to wished to hide their oppression. Certainly not. But the nature and extent of it could only be understood if you acknowledge the way in which it's denying ordinary people the opportunity to live fulfilled lives. Or even that inalienable expectation as individuals to be able to express yourself, to be able to express your history, your culture, which is something that I'm sure all of us here can immediately relate to. So third, the priority for the Palestinians I met was not the illusory debate about one state or two state. That, in reality, seemed as remote as setting up life on Mars. There wasn't the immediacy of that. What was immediate was the challenge of keeping their son in school, knowing that 1 in 3 boys in East Jerusalem don't complete their education. Or, which happened regularly, it happened to people I knew, whether it would be their home that the Israeli computer identified next for a midnight demolition. This, of course, is in times of relative peace. I had the fortunate experience of being there before this recent bout of violence and military action that the Israelis are engaged in. Now, the reality just seems, from the people I still am in contact with, just to keep their family alive seems to be their priority. So it became abundantly clear to me that during my time in East Jerusalem, that rather than a necessity, the worst parts, excesses of the occupation are entirely a systematic and orchestrated policy to subjugate the Palestinian people. So we have to make sure that we don't fall into that trap, because what it does, it serves to change the facts on the ground, but also to reduce the Palestinian identity simply to fit within the narrative of their obsession for martyrdom. It is for this reason that I suggest we need to shift the narrative back to the Palestinian people themselves and how they've been abandoned to suffer discrimination, abuse and violation of their most basic rights. And I certainly felt that, particularly comparing the defence and the ways in which us as individuals in Europe can secure our rights, whereas there is no system in place in Palestine for the Palestinian people. So I say this can only be done by a focus on the particular in respect of both rights and the individuals. So as Bilal has said, I think the format of this is to not, I don't want you to be just listening to me. It's useful to have an interactive discussion, and so later on I welcome both your questions and challenges on that. But before I do, I'll just conclude by putting it this way, that let's try and put the Palestinian people back at the centre of their struggle. Allow them to exist as individuals rather than simply a bloc, and thereby highlight how their most basic rights or simply imagined. It's a sleight of hand on the part of the Israelis. You need only scratch the surface in East Jerusalem, where I was living, is to understand that every act or omission is orchestrated to inhibit the Palestinian identity on the part of the Israelis. In my view, this has to be the focus of our advocacy and activism, not least because it's extremely powerful and I believe persuasive, but it's also the standard that we demand of other countries. So before I stop, I just want to say that there's lots of very specific instances and examples that I want to sort of bring out. But before that, I think it's a useful point to stop and for Zinnia to talk about what is a really relevant and specific example of exactly the sort of thing that I'm describing, the very specific, the very particular way of assisting Palestinians to help themselves, but also as individuals, as people who are earning a living, and she'll explain more. So, certainly as part of your questions, those things that you want to ask, and we'll try and discuss a little bit more about specific examples then. We'll leave it.
I hope everyone can hear me. My voice is quiet. Can everyone hear me? Assalamualaikum everyone. I'm Zinnia. I work for an organisation called MADE. We're a charity where we work with young people and train them to become campaigners and future leaders in social justice, poverty and the environment. Now in 2014, our charity is not a charity where we raise aid or those kind of funds. We tend to work with young people in campaigning and then working with the local community where they lobby for something that they're passionate about. And Palestine is an issue that always comes up. And we thought, how can we support Palestine? People have already given aid, they've marched, they've done demonstrations, they've signed petitions, but what is another way that we can help Palestine? So this is why we launched the Buy Palestinian campaign, where we believe that the best way to support Palestine is buying their produce, fair trade produce from Palestine, and which makes a difference. So I'll just tell you some facts about the Palestine, the produce. So in this country, Muslims spend £60 million on dates, which is actually bought from Israeli and settlers. And a lot of Muslims don't know that only 6% of produce is sent from Palestine to the UK. So at the moment, the kind of products we sell are dates, olive oil, za'atar and these herbs. Now what happens is the farmers have these land, and then what happens is that Israelis or the settlers make it so difficult that they can't produce this produce, and then they get into debt, and then the settlers offer them a lower price to buy that land off them, and then the farmers are rejected by their community, so they end up working on these farms. So they're trapped in this kind of circle of oppression. So we feel if the UK, there's 3 million people in the UK, if we all started buying this produce from these farmers, then that's the best way that we can support Palestine, and we feel that it's a sustainable way and a long-term solution rather than it being a quick solution where sometimes we see these things happen through other charities and we give aid, but then that doesn't last long. Now, over the last 2 years, we've invited a lot of farmers that have come over from Palestine, and we've directly spoken to them and we've asked them, do you know what the Muslim community do here? Actually, a lot of them don't. Most of their support is actually non-Muslims. And they were quite surprised to hear that we go on these demonstrations, we fundraise, but they say that it hasn't made much change. And they feel, if you really want to help us, then buy our produce. This is just a quote from one of our farmers. Behind every module date, we produce a community and a family. Selling our dates in the UK means everything to us. It means people are listening. It means that people are celebrating our dignity and supporting our future. And we are Palestine. So, over the last year, what we did a campaign where this Ramadan we really wanted to get people to understand why you pay £9 for our dates rather than paying £3.50 from Tesco dates. And what the difference is? The difference is that these dates it's a social enterprise. So it's all little farmers that have come together and then sell the dates to this company called Zaytoon. We take the dates and then we bring them to the UK and they get a fair price. So the price that they get for these dates is a living wage. So then all this extra money that they have left over, the community decides, right, we need a new school or we need to pay for a hospital, which is something that's a positive, and we feel that's a long-term way of helping Palestine. At the moment, all of the produce that we do sell through us and other distributors, we support 800,000 families, and that's only 6%. So if we could increase that by 20-30%, can you imagine what the difference we could make over the next couple of years? Another thing that I found quite surprising about learning about Palestine is no one ever talks about the other side of Palestine. We always see the negative side and we see what's happening in Gaza, but we never see the positive side and how that they have organic. Also, sorry, I forgot to mention that these products are also organic and they're not used with any pesticides, and there's a whole environmental policies that they have that I was really shocked at. I didn't think in Palestine you'd have these kind of policies, that they have these beliefs, and most of Palestine, it's a farming land, and some of the stories that we would hear from these farmers where this farmer said they helped this farmer where he had trees that been there since Prophet Isa's time, and it all got wiped out within 6 hours. And we don't want to have those kind of situations where that farmer gets into debt because they couldn't get this produce to us. And that's our campaign, so that's the message that we're trying. We're not asking for people to give money, we're not asking people to sign anything, petition or anything. All we're asking is that this is what the message that the farmers have told us is: buy our produce and let me be able to live a dignified life.
I'd like to thank both speakers. Just to wrap up before we go into Q&A, I think there were some very, very unique points that we got in there, and I think with Cal's, it was almost a short, sharp shock of a reminder that we're dealing with a people rather than just a cause or rather than just a topic that we fight for. And it's about people's homes, and it's people's right to go to school, and it's people's right to just life. And it almost reminds us that it's a cause for another set of people rather than supplanting our own ideals on it. And with Zinnias as well, we have this idea of a long-term, positive, sustainable set of acts you can do every day. Perhaps we probably can't always go on a march every weekend. We can make these small changes in our lives about thinking about the way that we shop, thinking about the way we live, and also how we think about how food and other items that we buy are sourced. And so, speaking of positive acts, one positive act you can all do is after the Q&As, head over to the maid store, which is right behind you, where you'll be met by two of the helpful volunteers who will raise their hands right now, as if by magic. There you go. And learn more about maid and or indeed buy some of the products that Zinnia was just talking about. We're now going to the Q&A. Just raise your hands, just introduce you by your name. If you have a specific question to one of the panel speakers, just say so and we can kick off. So, any questions?
So, my name is Husna, and thank you for the speech. And you're absolutely right in what you say about the Palestinian identity. And you know, I'm one of those people that has felt disheartened by the demonstrations. And the last one I didn't even go to because I just felt it didn't do much. But in terms of Palestinian identity, there's a whole, I'm very well aware of Geneva Convention about the space required per person and clean water, hygiene, basic human rights that are there, labelled in Geneva Convention, and it's very, very clear that these have been constantly denied by the Israelis on the Palestinian people. What shocks me is that this has never been addressed in a legal way, and I think that plays a part in the basic human right, the human component in Palestine. That's a very important aspect of it.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's a really relevant point. And what I would say is that the important thing is not to be disheartened, and I suppose that's easy for me to say, but the reason why I'm adamant about that is because the Palestinian people themselves take a huge amount of support and belief in the fact that there are these meetings, that there are people doing things. The point you raised about the Geneva Conventions and about the specifics, so the example you raised is about space and about water. I think that very much kind of comes into exactly the message that I wanted to try and give today, which is to say that it's those really specific elements which are actually fundamental but also very persuasive. So, you can get into a very circular discussion about whether Palestine is ready for a state. What is much harder to resist and defend is just the way in which fundamental elements of people's lives. So, there's no point looking to a body or a court, because unfortunately international law doesn't work like that. So you're not going to be able to get, we can talk about lots of security council resolutions, we can talk about the ICJ opinion in 2004. Ultimately, that is not going to really get much further than a statement of principle. But what we can do is make the argument in a much more detailed and specific way. So, if I can, just one example. So it doesn't have anything to do with specifically water, but water is a really big issue and it is almost a discussion in itself. But another example is, let me kind of introduce one of the people I met, which was a father of 6 children, lives in East Jerusalem, lives in the Mount of Olives. He's got children that range from 25 to 8, and he's a resident of East Jerusalem, but he's got what is known as a green card, so which essentially means that he was born in the West Bank, but is entitled to live in East Jerusalem because his wife has a blue identity card. So already we're getting into these notions of labelling, which sound from a different era. So she has a blue identity card, allows her to live in East Jerusalem. In 1967, when they took over, when they occupied East Jerusalem from the Jordanians, she was considered to be resident in East Jerusalem. So they've lived there. Through marriage, he's entitled to live there. 30 years he's living there. Every single year, he still has to apply to renew his permit. So despite this 30 years, every year he's got to go through this process of going to the Israeli authorities and saying, can I continue to live in my home where I brought up and live with my children and family? Luckily, so far, he's had that granted each year. But what can happen, and what has happened, is he's entirely subject to the political, to whatever colour of political parties in power and how harsh they want to be. So as a result of after the Second Intifada in 2000, they made a blanket policy that anyone with a green ID, i.e. a non-resident, somebody from the West Bank, but living in East Jerusalem, is unable to drive. So he's not subject to any criminal kind of offence. He's not caused any issues as far as the Israeli authorities under their own law. But as a matter of policy, he's unable to drive. And just imagine what that means for a man with a family in East Jerusalem. What it means for a man, a woman, anyone, but in this case, he's, as a father, he can't take his children to school. In terms of work, he's entirely subject to, he's limited to where he can work because of the fact that he can't get in a car. He's reliant on this. Now, if anyone can point to me any security or legitimate reason for that, other than just to exercise power, just to emasculate this individual, then I couldn't see it and I couldn't find anything. But it's examples like that I think when you really kind of dig in and you think, okay, well, that person that's kind of arguing about Israel's right to exist, actually, what about this man's right to exist? What about this family's right to exist? And so it's a long-winded way of saying that I think as much as, I think I'm not saying don't go on the demonstrations, don't sign the petitions, don't contact your MEPs and your MPs. I think what's also important is to really start focusing in on specific examples. And when you make that argument, when you have the discussions, be bold and be able to say, well, look, this isn't about this is just about basic humanity.
Actually, one of the stories I was going to say in the West Bank, some of the soaps that we have made is actually by this organisation that's actually a Jewish organisation. They're called Sinniana. And what they did is they found that a lot of women, Arab women, Muslim women that live in Israel aren't allowed to work. So they made this organisation where they buy the land on behalf of the Muslim women, and then they get them to make these soaps so they can have a living and they can still sustain and live in Israel. So there is some positive stories if you actually dig in and you actually look and you find these individual families.
But it's both of those kind of everyday examples that we often don't hear about. We hear about and we see protests. What we don't hear about is there's this organisation set up in Israel that makes soap, and that's the reason why. And when we talk about rights, it's not about these ethereal kind of esoteric rights. It's I can't drive my 6 kids to school. I have to apply to live in the same place I've lived for 30 years, and it's those every days. Thanks for the question. We have some more. That gentleman here.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Munir. I've spent a lot of time in Palestine and in Israel, so I can really understand what you're saying. I think one of the problems in terms of trying to change a narrative finds the people who have power and influence that control the narrative. And so, yes, we can have it, at a local level, but as soon as you try to take that to a national level, it becomes very difficult, especially, because the main narrative is coming through the main media houses. Although, social media is changing that, there are a lot of organizations doing very good things. I think that possibly the more practical point is, you talked about trade and some of the things that you're doing. I've been involved in international trade for about a year and a half now, and we're going to be meeting, not this Sunday, the following Sunday, for people who do want to discuss and talk about international trade. And one of the concepts that, we were thinking about, may sound a little bit radical, but perhaps it's a little bit more effective, is that we talk mostly about changing consumer habits, whereas habits of consumers are actually controlled at distributor level. So the likes of Tesco's, the big supermarkets are very influential in terms of controlling consumer habits. But what we also have to realize is that the Muslims are also very influential in distribution. So the biggest cash and carry is Best Way, and most of the independents in London, controlled, by the Muslims and primarily the Asian community. So it's really those people we need to target. So when you talk about Israeli dates, you might go to an independent store and you might see dates like Jordan Valley, which people don't know from Israel, so you buy the dates. So if we can stop those distributors, or those distributors who are Muslim carrying those dates, then that would have a bigger impact on consumer habits than perhaps dealing with it at retail level. That's the first point. The second point, and perhaps the more important point, is one of pricing. The argument, and it's always been a difficult argument with any product in terms of fair trade, why people should pay more money for product X, olive oil from Palestine, as opposed to olive oil from Spain. So we need to look at what is making the Palestinian product more expensive, and if it's to do with infrastructure on the ground, can the charities like yourself put in a structure like a Kadi Hasana, an interest-free loan system that would allow them to buy the equipment that will make their dates more competitive? And if you guys looked at that, and then maybe we can have a wider discussion about how we target the distributors so that we can move product in larger volumes and at a cheaper price.
So that was quite a long question.
I think perhaps as well, because it's also a very technical, detailed question as well, so I think that's worth following up afterwards. But in terms of the broader question, in terms of the supply chain as well, of how we tackle distributors rather than just consumers, that's a good question.
We do actually work, sorry I didn't mention that, we do work with, we did this campaign, we actually went to all our local shops. We did target all the Asian shops that already sell Israeli dates and had this discussion with them, and we tried to see that if they make this change, but actually it was the community that made the change. And over the last year, our charity, we're based in Whitechapel, so everyone knows that's quite a dominant Asian area, and if you go there now, you'll see Zaytun products in every single window, because we got our community, especially the women in our community, to understand why they should be supporting this, and then that's what changes. So they went to the shops and they said, we're not going to buy your dates, we want these kind of dates, and that put the pressure on for these shopkeepers to actually change their suppliers. I mean, I'm not going to say that some suppliers, they looked at it and they went, well, why should I buy it for there? I'm only going to make £3.50, and where I can make a bigger markup on buying these cheaper things. But then that's up to that individual. We can't change everyone, but we can start making those changes. The other reason that you were saying about price and why fair trade prices are higher is because you have to pay people along the way. It's not just going directly just to the farmer. If you want to keep it sustainable, there's a person along the whole supply chain that needs to get paid a certain wage in order to keep it sustainable. Now, there are some distributors that work with Zaytun that sell it and they don't keep any profit. But at the end of the day, we're a charity as well, and if you want to continue with this message and this campaign, then we have to make a little bit of profit in order to sustain the campaign. And I'm happy to talk to you later about more in depth about your questions.
Just, I haven't got anything to add on the specific element of the international trade and the production line, but it might be worth kind of bringing that kind of into a discussion about BDS, because that's essentially kind of on a more individual level, that's essentially what we're talking about. And I kind of, the boycott, divestment and sanctions policy. So the BDS is an organisation and is very well established now. I encourage you all, if you haven't, to look at their website. It's very detailed, it's very specific, and it very much seeks to energize and to empower individuals to take steps. Now, why I bring that up is how that feeds into the bigger picture, and how that that larger narrative. And actually, what's interesting is that it is having an effect. So individuals acting as individuals and also collectively, we know it's having an effect for a number of reasons, but one particular reason is that governments sympathetic to Israeli lobbies are seeking to ban certain forms of boycott and divestment. So, and I know that if in terms of who are we trying to persuade, we're not going to persuade the Zionists, but we are going to persuade all those kind of in the middle, where they just kind of have bought in to this idea that there's two sides, they're fighting it out amongst one another, one's as bad as the other, and it's all, actually, when you start saying, well, as the date example is a really good one, the settlement, it's indefensible. So the Jordan Valley, you've got Israeli companies, not just food companies, makeup, cosmetics companies, that are essentially funded, that are subsidized to operate within the Jordan Valley, accepted under international law as illegally, that they're operating illegally, because that's a settlement under the Geneva Convention and the various UN resolutions. They cannot exploit that land. So there's very little. So you always get this, that you get people who are, they want to move that topic on, because it's almost impossible to kind of make an argument for saying, well, why are you there? How can, you're profiting from this. So sorry, just one last point in terms of how this is having an effect. And don't forget, recently, after a long, lot of work by a lot of different organizations and bodies, the EU are requiring Israel to label settlement goods. So that, to say, these, yes, it's slow, and it's, you come up against lots of barriers and you come up against lots of resistance. But, I've heard this a lot, and I do believe it, that, public opinion, there's a momentum which is much more in favour of the position that the Palestinian supporters and themselves are advocating than there is about this line that they're all just there to blow themselves up.
I'm just looking at the man with the plan. It's 10:02. Do we have 10 minutes, or do we have 10 minutes? That's great. If we could perhaps, we had a question there. Do we have any more questions? Yes, could you see? Okay, so there's 3 questions. All right. Sister, could we ask be as reasonably brief as possible, and if I could ask the speakers perhaps to get all of them in. I wasn't looking. that was just, I couldn't help but gaze at you. That's the problem. So if you could introduce yourself and make questions.
Just about the point of BDS, our mayor was in Israel last week and made some very ridiculous remarks about the BDS movement. And the reason how we know BDS is working is because when Netanyahu goes to AIPAC, all he talks about is BDS. So you know that the Israeli government is worried and scared. And what does our mayor do is basically say this is a bunch of lefties that this movement won't make a difference. So I think, well, as Londoners, what do we have to say back to the mayor? And what does that mean in terms of the BDS? I was surprised actually that there wasn't much of an outcry from the UK. And we can use that to kind of maybe reinvigorate the BDS movement locally, especially with the EU labelling, which would be really easy now.
I'm going to take all 3 questions, if that's right. Could I have the next gentleman? So we'll have all 3 questions at the same time.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not too heavily involved in the community or these kind of talks, but I have come across the BDS movement before. That's just through social networks and the fact that it's quite prominent. The one thing I wasn't really aware of is the products that you guys are selling from Zayton. I think what could be useful is if you guys try and increase, say, social media kind of existence or try and promote your message a lot further. I think that will help your cause a great deal. And I guess my question is, what are you guys going to do and try and do that?
Tasha?
It's just 2 very quick questions actually. One is just following up from this gentleman's, which is what is the best and easiest way to get hold of your products if you want to change your consumer preference to buy them? And one for Cal, which is you talk about changing the narrative and focusing on the individuals, whereas I think this is a great idea to go alongside the bigger messages that still need to be had. How do you get hold of those stories? Where do you get them from? I mean, it's great coming to listen to you today because you've been there and done that, but day to day, where's the best way to get those stories?
Okay, so those questions are on Bojo and all his brilliance, or lack thereof. A question following up on BDS movement and how to improve publicity maybe from what we made. And a 2-part question, which is, 1, tell us a bit more about MADE and how we can get in touch, and also talking about the narrative a bit more. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'll start with the question on about social media. We did actually have a big campaign, and it's more that we'd like local people just put hashtag Buy Palestinian. I heard about this campaign, and then just put our link to our website. We do sell the products online, but there are many more distributors around the UK that sell it as well. Or you yourself can become a distributor. If you want to go to Zaytoon, you can ask them and you can sell the products. You go and take the products and sell it in your local community. The people that I met with Zaytoon, majority of them were non-Muslims. They inspired me so much that they take their weekend weekends off, they go to church, they even turn up at mosques every Friday selling these products because they want to help these individual families. So that's one way you could support them. And just telling your friends and family, hey, look, this is another way. Another thing that I would say about the BDS movement, this is something that the Palestinians themselves have told me, don't stop. One thing I didn't realise about Palestine is most of their produce that they buy is actually from Israel. So they're kind of stuck buying products from them, earning that money, but they don't have anything themselves. So that's why I really believe in the Buy Palestinian campaign, because it helps build their economy and then they can produce things for themselves. So for example, when there is conflict going on, the farmers have food, have produce where they're like, it's fine, we don't have to have water, we don't have to, because we can produce it ourselves, and that's what we want to do, empower these farmers so they become independent and they have a strong economy that supports them.
Okay, I'm going to try and be equally succinct. Just on the BDS thing, what I find amazing as well, that the idea of individual choice is almost kind of, what the Conservative Party as a free market party is all about, individuals exercising their individual rights and choices, but yet they feel that they can limit us in making those choices when, for whatever reason, we choose to make those choices. So that's the inherent contradiction, and it's evident that it's very political. And I think this goes to also the point that I think Faraz made. I think in all of this, what's really important is when you get sent the Facebook kind of information, the update, or you get sent a news article, there is so much online, and we have to be a little bit more discerning. We have to be a little bit more analytical about, because there's some really good websites. The BDS, it's very well argued, it's thought through. There's really good news organizations that, there's organizations that very much work with Israelis who are against the occupation and Palestinians, try and bring a more a fairer, a more accurate depiction. So I think my answer is really yes. It's one thing about these organisations promoting what they do, but equally it's incumbent upon us to really kind of, I think, find the right sources, and they are out there. I think it's a really important point about, how do we get this sort of information, and despite everything, like you, Asha, who've followed this closely, I was genuinely shocked. It kind of exceeded my worst expectations, because you just don't get a feel for that. And so I'm happy to kind of, maybe on the Sixth Circle website and stuff, provide a list of some really good news organisations that they're based largely online, but are respected and kind of credited, and all those things that attempt and often do portray a more even-handed sense of what it's like. So like a particular example about the date picking, or the olives, so olive oil, as Zaytun also produces olive oil. There were a group of what can only, they were white British retirees, women typically, who go out to Palestine every year to pick olives from certain parts of the West Bank, because the farmers themselves can't get on their own land, because it's been designated. There's various different designations, but it could be a seam zone, which is a territory in between property, or it could be taken as military land. So as soon as they enter that land, they get shot at. So these British, white, and that's how broad the support is. They go every year, they pick these olives for these local communities to use for olive oil. So, yes, it doesn't, I'm sorry, the other thing I would say is, the situation now, sorry Bilal, very quickly, the situation now, admittedly, is very tense, but I would encourage whoever has the opportunity to go out there. The West Bank felt safer. It's like Ramallah is like going to Amman. You go to East Jerusalem, and like the Israelis have this no, I'm going to stop there, otherwise I'll just go on. But
Don't stop now.
just very quickly then, they have you'll see busloads of young Americans who are given money to come to visit Israel. So they come and they get taken everywhere, and it's to establish this kind of circle that goes on, that, you know, they come to Israel, it's their heritage, it's their, you know, kind of history, and they support the organizations which support Israel back in the States, influencers, you know, you see them everywhere. What does Palestine have? People like me are reluctant. Before I went for this last 6 months, I was reluctant because I thought, well, how much of a hard time am I going to get from the Israelis, first and foremost? Am I going to get through the airport? I was in Jordan once, I could have quite easily crossed, and I thought, do I want to spend a day in a kind of a checkpoint? So I didn't do it. But it's not, you're absolutely entitled to go. I would encourage all of you, choose the right situation, choose the circumstances, and then visit. And then tell people, talk to people about your experience, talk to people about, you know, what products you're buying and why you shouldn't be buying it, but then just reinforce that by the facts. I think sometimes it's a little bit, oh look, McDonald's, let's boycott McDonald's. You know, it's a little bit knee-jerk. Why are you boycotting McDonald's? Why are you not boycotting it in other countries? Whereas there's really good arguments for taking action. So
very good, good point. Do we have any more burning questions? We probably have time for one more. Perhaps unless there's nobody who hasn't made point 4.
It's just a really quick one.
Sure.
Can you just post up some of the websites of, especially the olive picking group, and how?
So you do actually do that as well.
Do they?
We're trying to organise one as well ourselves.
Okay.
And also speaking, if you do want to hear more stories, we have this thing called Made Cafe. So I always invite whether it's farmers or people from Palestine that have come over, and then you can have like a one-to-one session where they sit and talk. So last month we had a woman from Hebron, especially about everything that was happening in Hebron over the last month. She came and she was like, don't stop visiting, because it changes depending on which borough you go to. It's not the way the media show it, that, oh no, you're not going to be safe and it's not the thing. She was just keep coming here, come and learn from us, exactly what you were saying.
can I plug the article, for examples, for whoever's not written it? There was an article I wrote in Mufta magazine. It's an online magazine, and that's got other examples as well.
Great.
Are there any groups or organisations you'd encourage us to look into if we would like to make a trip over to either do some charity work or do some other cooking?
Yeah, I'm very happy to list organisations that I came into contact with and I feel do a good job in providing people with that experience. I'm very happy to do that.
Can we, I'm looking at the man with the plan, can that be put up on the City Circle website? We can get that organised for him. Okay, that'd be helpful. Great. On that helpful note, unless there's any more for any more, I think we'd just like to thank both of our speakers for really great food for thought. As always, don't forget to stop off at the maid desk, and also if you'd like to help support City Circle, there's a contribution box at the back.